My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. Well, what inspired you to write Grounded in Grace? And what need, I guess, were you hoping to address for parents and families in that?
Yeah, great question, Riley. I would say at first it initially just grew out of so many counseling conversations I was having with parents. And as parents were seeking help in raising their kids and having conversations with their teens, and particularly, I think anybody who's watched the news or, read various magazines or books, that mental health issues facing teens and kids today, it's an enormous challenge. So many parents are facing really tough times with their kids and teens, whether it's depression or suicide or anxiety or issues related to school and academics. And the more and more I talk to parents, the more and more I realize I think a lot of the things that kids today struggle with actually tie all the way back to identity. How do we think about ourselves? How do we think about God and how He created us? And also, just being a dad of four kids, these are conversations I have. And so I think that that's probably what prompted the writing of the book and kind of researching some of it and just really wanting to help give parents some practical tools, both to understand how identity is formed and also to understand their role in that process as parents that God's entrusted these kids to.
Did you see some kind of gap in the literature
Yeah.
that needed to be spoken to? Okay.
Riley, a lot of times, like in some of the things that I see and read, when parents are looking for help related to mental health, especially or identity issues, it's phones, it's technology, kids need to get out and play more. And I agree with all that. We could talk about phones and talk about technology, but I really also want to just focus on our children and their hearts because as children, how they think about themselves, how they view themselves. I think that children and teens are more influenced by our culture than we probably think, or more than we realize. And I think our kids and teens today are facing enormous pressure to be the best that they can be, to be their authentic self, to listen deeply to their feelings and figure out who they are. And while there's some good to that, I think the overwhelming product of it is it's produced a lot of confusion and anxiety and depression for a lot of kids today. And so my hope in the book is just that parents would see, listen, at the end of the day, the most important thing about our kids and teens is understanding who created them, and that's God, and understanding what God says about them and says about their identity. And so just wanting parents to make sure that both at 2 years of age, at 12 years, or even at 22 years of age, that they really live out and embody that message to their kids and teens.
Oh, yeah, I mean, surely other people have written probably generally on this topic of
Yeah,
identity, but are you taking a bit of a new approach to it that you didn't
uh,
see?
that's a great question. I don't know if I'm taking a, Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun, so
Oh,
I don't
sure.
want to in any way say that I'm taking a new turn, but the way hopefully maybe the book is structured is different in that
Okay.
it's accessible and it's meant to be really readable for parents. I mean, you're a parent, I'm a parent. We don't have a lot of time on our hands, so I tried to be brief and concise. So in the middle of the book, Riley, the middle of the book really talks about five major identity struggles that kids and teens have, both academically, in sports, Christian moralism, like just being a good person, and then gender issues and sexual orientation issues. And so if you kind of put those two things into buckets, the first three chapters talk about I am what I do. And the second two chapters are really rooted in I am what I feel. So, regardless of where your child or teen maybe struggles to find their identity, I hope that there's a readable, concise chapter that you could just kind of pull off your shelf and read to help equip you to both understand the issue as well as to give you some practical tools to enter into your kids' lives thoughtfully with questions and with biblical wisdom and guidance.
I really appreciated the compact nature of it.
Yes,
Big books are good sometimes, but
they are.
it's I don't know. Sometimes it's less intimidating or easier to jump into something that doesn't feel quite
Yeah.
so weighty.
Yes.
Not to
Amen.
say
Amen.
you were a good writer. You held my attention. Absolutely, I could have read more, but I do like those compact ones sometimes, and even as a pastor, easier to hand out
It
uh,
is. It
to
is.
parents.
And And, parents are busy nowadays. They're looking for things that are digestible and readable. And so there are a lot of other resources I try to recommend and point people to in the book, but at least this could be at least a helpful entry point for you to kind of get a basic grasp of the issues
Hmm.
and understand some of the basic dynamics associated with identity.
Well, what role, Jonathan, does grace play in shaping a child's identity? And I guess how does that differ from maybe a cultural or performance-based identity model?
Absolutely. Well, I would say in the book, one of the main lines that you'll probably hear repeated throughout the book is a gospel identity is an identity that is received and not achieved. It's received and not achieved. It is a gift of God's grace. It is a gift of God's grace to say, listen, I've created you in my image. I've declared it very good. And being an image bearer of God, this is what I've called you to do and what I've equipped you to do. And that is gracious. And it's gracious at one level in that you and I don't have to figure out all of the things related to our identity. We don't have to have the whole burden of figuring out who we are. That's an enterprise that's completely autonomous and self-directing. God tells us, listen, I've made you in my image. This is what I've called you to do, and this is what flourishing looks like. And I think that that actually is quite freeing, and it's a quite freeing message to many kids and teens today because, as you picked up there in your question, Ryley, so much of our culture puts the burden of self-definition on the individual. So you have to go out, trailblaze your own path, kind of discover who you are as a person, your true, authentic self. So we call this philosophy culturally expressive individualism. So you'll kind of see the monikers of expressive individualism all over the place. Be your true self or live your own truth or be authentically you. Those are some of the monikers and slogans of expressive individualism. And it kind of sounds good. It sells books and things like that. But what it basically tells kids and teens is, listen, you have to dig deep into your feelings, figure out it is who you are and what you want to be, and then you've got to go out and live it and sustain it for the rest of your life. And you do that either completely rooted in your feelings, or you have to do it completely rooted in your performance or your activities. And frankly, it's just a tall order, for a 10th grader whose entire identity is built on, let's say, how they do in sports. What do you do when you have a not so good game of basketball? Or if your entire identity is rooted in what college you get into, what happens when you get a denial letter rather than an acceptance letter? And so it's things like that where I think as parents, we don't oftentimes realize just how much culture is shaping our kids, both through music and social media and technology and influencers, but even how we can, as Christians, kind of slip into that performance-based mentality of you are what you do. You are your good works. Are you a good person? And so again, the message throughout the book is a message of God's grace to you as a child of God.
Can I ask, was this very research based, like you looking at kids and kind of developing a theology of identity, or is there a personal level to this that
Yeah,
some of this
yeah,
came out of your own growing up,
yeah.
your
Maybe a
identity shaping? Sorry.
Yes, that's a really good an insightful question on your part, Riley. I would say some of it probably is more of personal interest to me. I'm an adoptee, so I was born overseas, came over to America at a young age, and I think being adopted, a huge issue that adoptees face is questions of identity. Who am I? I look different than everybody else around me. How do I make sense out of that? How do I kind of order and orient my world? And so I do think identity has always been an issue that I've been interested in. But at the beginning of the book, I do talk about just, I would say, the unique contribution that some of Tim Keller's writings and resources in speaking has been on me in helping me understand how identity is formed. And so in the first part of the book, I talk about traditional identity and modern identity, which are really kind of the two dominant identity formation processes that over the course of human history sociologists would say this is how people form a sense of who they are. And so I did do a lot of research, both from Tim's writings and then kind of following the footnotes from Tim's writings into other writings. But what I tried to do was summarize it into a way that's really understandable for just average people like myself, for readers of the book to be able to understand something that can kind of tend to be a little bit more philosophical, but kind of, put it into terms and in ways that just the average ordinary parent could be able to pick up and understand and take something away helpful.
I just my own interest as you followed those threads. Who were some of the guys in that identity shaping that influenced Keller?
Yeah. So one of the big people that you'll read about or hear about when you read Keller is a guy named Charles Taylor. Charles
Okay,
Taylor was
sure.
a Canadian
Yeah, yeah,
philosopher.
yeah.
Hats off to the Canadians. Charles Taylor, I would say, is probably the biggest influence, at least that I read, especially today in modern day writings on identity. So, Charles Taylor wrote a really crucial book on this topic called Sources of the Self. And then he has written other books, but that was probably the main one. It is very dense, very big. So, if you are ambitious, pick up a copy, but it's pretty heavy weighting.
Okay.
Another person that I think is within this orbit is Carl Trueman. And so Carl Trueman wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Modern Individualism. And
Mhm.
I might get that, I might have gotten that title wrong. It's a longer title, but you can Google it. But it's a really dense book, but it is still readable. And Truman, who's a professor at Grove City College here in the western part of Pennsylvania, he talks a lot about identity formation as well and how culture shapes a sense of who we are as individuals. And so you can pick up the book, my book, and you can even follow some of my footnotes to find some of those other people. But those would probably be two people that come to mind that have done quite a bit of work in that particular area.
I won't go down this rabbit trail, but it's interesting that Taylor, who I don't think I ever identified as a Christian, that he had such an influence on Keller's thinking
Yes.
in these ways, and I'm sure influence on so many more. Uh,
Yes, yes. A lot of the terminology when you think about identity, like one of the things that Charles Taylor talks about in Sources of the Self is he says we live in the age of authenticity.
okay.
And it really does capture, I think, a lot of kind of the vibe and the ethos of Gen Zers in particular. When I talk to Gen Zers about identity, the thing that keeps coming back, that keeps coming up is I just want to live my authentic self. I just want to be authentically me. I want to live my own truth. And so what you can hear in all those phrases is now the source of truth no longer belongs to someone outside of me or to a truth source outside of me, namely God, religion, the church, but I own it. I am my own source of truth. Ergo, I get to define and set all the rules for who it is that I am and who it is that I want to be. And so you can kind of see then how that leads to confusion about gender and sexual orientation. Our bodies and God don't tell us who we are as male and female or God's design for sexuality. You get to choose, you get to define it. So you get to do whatever you feel like doing. And not that feelings are entirely bad, but as I often times tell my clients and my kids, feelings are good, but they make better passengers than drivers
Oh,
in the
that's
car.
good. Yeah.
So they're good to have. God created us with feelings and emotions, but they are not reliable markers of who God called us to be as individuals.
I want to ask you this because this is probably getting off topic and will be another conversation, but I'd be interested to know where you would push back maybe against Taylor and sources of self, and if there are any areas like that. Maybe, as I think of someone like Jordan Peterson, it's like he offers us a lot, but then there are some things that don't quite,
Exactly.
uh, you
Exactly.
know,
Exactly. And I
but,
think
oh,
you
sorry, go
run
ahead.
into that. You definitely run into that with people, I'm sure, like Charles Taylor or Jordan Peterson, where yeah, they're saying things that echo or maybe similarly testify to the truth of Scripture. But at the end of the day, we got to go back to Scripture and what Scripture says about who we are, and that's what essentially we try to do in the book together.
Well, you already mentioned this, but you identify in the book these five key areas where teens struggle with identity. Is there one of these or two maybe that seem the most pervasive
Yeah,
right now?
yeah. Definitely. And this is a question even, I would, again, if we could have side conversations, I'd love to pick your brain too.
Yeah.
I would say right now, especially in the church, amongst church kids who have grown up in the church, I have a whole chapter on Christian moralism. And what I find with a lot of kids and teens in Christian homes is their identity is just rooted in being a good person. And so they don't really have their own personal faith in Christ. It's more of their parents' faith or what their parents tell them to do. If you ask a kid, why do you go to church? Well, because my parents make me. Why do you read the Bible? I don't know. My parents tell me to. Um, and when you talk to them about who they are as a person, what does a relationship with Christ look like? What you get is a lot of just Christian moralism and legalism. Like, I just want to be a really good person.
Hmm.
And again, there's a lot of good in that. We want our kids to follow Christ, and there's good behaviors that flow out of that. But our behavior does not bring about our identity or acceptance before Christ. And that's the whole grace part. We are saved and changed by God's grace. And then we are called to live according to what God has called us to. And so that's where identity informs activity. Our activity doesn't form our identity. And I think that for a lot of Christian kids growing up in Christian homes, that is a pretty common struggle that they face. Um, in terms of second or third, I would say that gender and sexual orientation issues. I mean, I'm sure both in Canada here and in the States. I mean, that's kind of the topic du jour. Kids today don't hold to a biblical ethic of sexuality and God's design for sex and gender as a whole culturally. And I think in many ways that is rooted in issues of identity. If I can choose whom to love, if I can choose how to identify without any thought of who God is and how he created me, then, as Dostoevsky said in Brothers Karamazov, without God, everything is permissible. So if I can kind of take God out of the equation, then I can do whatever it is I want to be. I can write my own script of life.
Hmm.
And what I would say to parents is there's a certain appeal to that to many kids, but later on down the road, it breaks down because frankly, it's just too much pressure for one individual to both create and sustain that kind of an identity over the balance of their lifetime.
Thinking specifically about that, maybe that gender confusion and sexual orientation, maybe speaking practically, do you have ways that you think parents can that would help parents navigate
It's,
conversations about those
yes.
kind of topics in a way that reflects grace and truth? And
Absolutely. The one thing is even the word you're saying, conversations. I would say parents don't shy away from conversations about gender and sex. I don't know about you. I didn't grow up where sex and gender were talked about hardly at all.
hmm
It was kind of a taboo topic. You didn't talk about sex. You didn't really talk about any of those issues. And today, I think a lot of parents just feel ill-equipped to talk about God's design for sexuality. Maybe in some ways because they don't understand God's design for sexuality. So depending on where you identify generationally, millennials, boomers, Gen Xers, et cetera, you might not have a firm grasp of a biblical view of those things. And so therefore it might be tough for you to communicate. When I talk to parents, Riley, a lot of parents tell me one of two things. Either A, they feel like it's too early to start, or they feel like it's too late to start. So I'll
okay.
have parents tell me, they're like, hey, my kid's 16 or 17, and I just feel like I missed the bus on that, and it's just too late to help my kid. Or I'll have parents who say, oh, my kid's too young. I'm just going to wait till they're a little bit older. And kind of my general sense of counsel and encouragement to parents is it's never too early and it's never too late to start talking about God's design for sex and gender. And so, again, there's creative ways that you can do that through different books, exercises, teaching, videos. There's a lot of different resources out there that weren't there 5 or 10 years ago, frankly, for
Okay.
parents and for disciplers. But if parents are listening to this or if they're reading the book, my encouragement would be have those conversations, enter into them with grace, compassion, and understanding and clarity.
And you're saying conversations, which I
Yeah.
think we would probably land in a similar age and generation and stuff. I feel like I grew up, if parents talked about it, it was this idea that you need to have the one talk.
Yes.
Would you
Bingo.
say
Yeah.
now it's more that, yeah, just an ongoing discussion of these things that can't start too early and can just
Never
continue on?
too late. Never too late. And Riley, that's such a great observation. These are conversations, plural.
Okay.
And when you think about, if any parent out there is thinking like, okay, I need to have one conversation, I mean, golly, that puts a lot of pressure on
Yeah.
you to, find the right time and to catch your kid at the right stage. And that's why I advocate for early and often, because these are conversations and they don't need to be long. They don't need to be awkward. Sometimes even noticing internally what feels awkward for you
Mhm.
is the first step in even having the conversation of, okay, if I have this conversation, I'm going to feel uncomfortable, or I'm going to feel anxious, or I'm going to feel ill-equipped, and just recognizing some of that. And I talk about that in the book. I actually try to help parents identify even pre-conversation what might be some things that might be hurdles for you before having the conversation. And frankly, that's half the battle is just simply battling your own sense of inadequacy, feeling ill prepared or ill equipped, and just really resting confidently in who the Lord is, what He's revealed to us in His Word, and what He's called and equipped you to do then in your child and teen's life.
Not trying to make you say something critical about the church, but in your view, how could the church do better at
Yeah,
this? Whether it's
no,
the equipping parents part or the beginning those conversations, from a
yeah.
biblical perspective.
Great question, Riley. And I would say just talk about it. Same thing
Okay.
that we're doing even now and what we're encouraging parents to do. How can parents or how can pastors, elders, deacons, women's ministry leaders, discipleship group leaders, how can we be planting seeds of regular conversation about God's design for sex and gender? And here's a practical example. So much of what the world says about the church is that the church is all about restricting your freedom. They just don't want you to really enjoy all of the things out there. They want to tie you down to monogamous, heterosexual relationships. It's all about no, 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 no.
Mhm.
And I actually think that when you look at Genesis 1 and 2, the first words of God to Adam and Eve are actually words of invitation, not prohibition.
Mm.
So God says to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Long before God says no, he says yes.
That's
Long
such a good
before
point.
God says no, he says go. And I think so often as parents, we lose that positive message. So what
Mhm.
happens is you and I are the bad people, right? We talk about the dangers of premarital sex. We talk about, God's plan for sexuality is, don't go this route, don't identify this way. But we don't first ground it in, no, here's the positives of what God has given to us. For instance, gender is a gift of God's grace. God creating you male or God creating you female is not restrictive, but creative. It's not prohibitive, it's beautiful. It shows a complementarity that is represented all throughout the Genesis narrative. So, as God is creating light and dark, the land and the sea, separating the air above from the air below, it's all about binaries. It's all about this complementarity that really speaks to the beauty and glory of God, so that on the sixth day, when God creates male and female, that's not incidental or accidental, it's purposeful. And we forget that. And so we think about gender as being restricted or a quote social construct, when what I would want to tell my kids from an early age is, hey, it is so good that God made you a girl. It's so good that God made you a boy because that is a gift of God's grace. And now, as a boy or as a girl, God's called you to live a life that is in service and in relationship to Him, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Maybe this is the same question, but a little different. But where do you think, say, as parents and as the church, where do we make them? I don't know, the most mistakes. Where do we go wrong right now when
Oh,
we're addressing these things?
yeah. Well, I don't know if I have a good answer on that, but I
Okay.
guess because of my own stage of life, I would probably say maybe in the later years. I think a lot of times in the later years, uh, and by later years, I would think maybe preteen through, upper high school, so 13
Okay.
to 18. I think we underestimate the power of our kids' peers and the social influences that they're surrounded with.
Okay.
Meaning, at a younger age, kids really look up to their parents. They think their parents are cool and, they want to spend a lot of time with them. And, as your kids get a little bit older, they, kind of think you're old fashioned and antiquated and they want to hang out more with their peers. And so their peers in television and streaming devices and YouTube and TikTok and Snapchat become more the dominant voices. And I think sometimes parents step away actually rather than step in.
Mm,
And I think sometimes that can be a little bit of a mistake.
okay.
And then they're oftentimes surprised of, oh, my kid's disengaging with me, or I feel more disconnected. And I know I don't do this perfectly. If you came and observed me in my home, there are many times I could reclaim time for conversation that I don't. So if anyone's hearing this, no, I'm more like you than I am different. I'm not coming by way as an expert, but as a fellow struggler that I have to remind myself of this, of what does it look like as my kids, who are, I have several that are in the teen and preteen years. How do I make the most of every moment with them?
Well, building on that, then, those gospel centered conversations, uh, can you share an example of how parents might initiate those
Yeah,
conversations and discussions with their children?
great, great question. Some of the conversations I think when we think about gospel-centered conversations, we think they have to have a lot of like five-syllable words in them or,
Sure.
be describing some type of abstract theological concept. But, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, he says, whether therefore you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. So if we can eat or drink to God's glory, then even the most ordinary of conversations, that can be done to the glory of God. So, just even listening well to your kids and knowing how to enter into conversations. Maybe they make a comment about a same-sex couple that they saw walking down the street, or a same-sex couple that they saw on a movie or on a TV show, and just taking a moment and say, "Oh, well, what do you think about that? Tell me a little bit more. What do you think about that? What do you think God has to say about an issue like that?" And just using some of those everyday moments that oftentimes just present themselves on a little bit of a silver platter, as it were, and just using those to kind of dive in and dive deep to say, well, hey, listen, we serve a God who has created us male and female and who has revealed himself to us and told us what his plan of flourishing is for us. And now, again, that probably sounds way too, adult for a 14 or 16-year-old, but oftentimes, I think you can attenuate and contextualize those conversations for your child and teen because you know your child and teen best, and you'll know the rhythm of conversations and how they go. So the main thing is just start, just try. If you get nervous about failing, you'll never start. And so you might start a conversation and your kid's like, tuning you out. Don't let that discourage you. Don't let that stop you from engaging again. Kids by nature are fickle, they're transitory. One morning they like mac and cheese, and by the afternoon they hate mac and cheese. So,
Sure.
don't get too discouraged, parents, if at first try your conversation doesn't take. Just keep trying, keep pressing in, and most of all, really go to the Lord and ask for help.
Yeah. I think I asked this rhetorically, but is the conversation, or I suppose, is the lifestyle of the parent just as important as the conversation they're going to have? I,
Yeah, I
in
I
terms of
really agree
the
with that.
child, especially a preteen or a teen, hearing
Yeah.
it but not seeing it
Yes.
exemplified in their parent.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think one of the things I identify early on in the book is that sociologically and developmentally, a parent's voice will be the dominant voice in their child's life because more often than not, the parent is going to be with the child more than any other individual. So your ability to shape and to form your child's identity is immense. It is crucial. It is a stewardship from God, that God entrusts to you. And so much of that stewardship is in how you live. It is in how you talk. It's in how you relate to your body. So for instance, if you just go around talking about how you hate yourself or how you hate your body or
Mm.
how you hate that God made you a boy or God made you a female or whatever it might be, then yeah, don't be surprised if that creates dynamics then later on for your kids. Or if you never talk about sex, if you never talk about sexuality at all, the lack of communication is going to communicate something to your
Mm.
kids.
Sure.
This is something taboo. There's something dirty about sex that we shouldn't talk about. And again, my encouragement to parents, Ryley, is that today, especially, there are just so many great resources out there to help parents in this way than I've ever seen before. 5, 10, 15 years ago, there were just not a lot of resources to encourage parents in this way. But I'm finding more and more there are some really solid gospel-centered resources out there that parents can avail themselves of.
So many more resources than there ever has been. Do you think at the same time the issues are
Yeah,
more, I don't know, yeah, more just more plentiful than they've ever been?
yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes I do wonder, I'm like, okay, do we just have more mental health issues and struggles with our kids than ever before? Or is it just this is the time that we're living in, so it feels especially acute?
Hmm.
Uh, Again, I tend to be more of, hey, I think every generation, every time period in history has had their own particular and unique struggles. So I don't think we're unique in that regard. And the reason I say that is I just read the book of Corinthians, for instance, and I read all of Paul's instructions there to that church set in a very pagan society
Hmm.
about sex and gender and just everyday issues. And I realize this is not just unique to our time period. This has been a struggle since the beginning of time. And even in my Bible reading plan right now, I'm finishing up Genesis, and so much of Genesis is talking about sexual brokenness, relational brokenness, issues amongst family. And so, again, I think as soon as sin entered into the world, the effects of how that sin works out, that's been every single generation from then until now.
Well, what advice would you have for parents, Jonathan, whose children are deeply attached to performance in sports
Whoa.
or academics and these things as a measure of their own self-worth? I think we've already kind of circled around this a little, but
Well, when I talk about this in the chapter, the first person that I say it starts with is you. So you really need to do a little bit of self-introspection as to what type of messages and narratives are you communicating. And I'll just pick on myself as a category here. Being an Asian American individual, academics is really important to me. It's an important thing in our culture. And so I know that my kids can feel a lot of pressure from me academically. My
okay.
kids oftentimes talk about how their friends can get certain grades that if they bring home that they know I'm not pleased with. So one day my daughter brought home, like something that she'd gotten a B on or something, and she said that's like an Asian F, and I got a good laugh out of that. But a lot of times in my particular ethnic background, grades and what college you get into, what your SAT score, what your ACT score is a mark of your identity. How smart are you? How advanced are you going to be? Are you going to be a surgeon, a lawyer, somebody that makes a lot of money? And uh, that just puts a lot of pressure on kids today. And you see that affecting kids and teens today in enormous ways, whether through depression, anxiety, lack of sleep because they're staying up late studying for tests and tutoring and getting ready for college preparatory exams and whatnot. And so, what I try to strike a balance in the book is it's not wrong to want to pursue academic excellence. It's not wrong to have a goal to get into a particular college, but that's not what your worth is loaded in, right?
Mm.
Your worth is not whether or not you get an A plus, a 4.0, or a 1600 on your SATs, or if you get into Harvard University. Your worth is in our Savior who died and gave himself up for you. Your worth is in who God says you are. Now, what can flow out of that is a desire to use your gifts, talent, and treasure for the Lord's glory. But the order is so important here, right? The order is so important here. We want to have God's voice being the foundation, And then our academic pursuits coming out of that, not our academic pursuits dictate how we view ourselves before the Lord. And I know for me, it is still a constant struggle to make sure that I am rightly communicating expectations as a parent about grades and things of that nature related to academics, while also affirming to my kids that they are known and loved by the Lord.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. I appreciate that answer. Maybe coming out of that kind of what practical tools or reflections or reflection exercises from the book have you personally found most effective in your own, whether it be ministry or family parenting?
Yeah. One of the things, especially in the chapter on athletics, three of my daughters play competitive sports and they play
Okay.
basketball. And one of the things that we've really tried to do with them, not consistently, not all the time, so don't hear me wrongly, but as often as we can, before and after games, we just tell them, we say, regardless of how you perform out on that court, we still love you no matter
Mm.
what. And it's a simple affirmation. A lot of times they kind of roll their eyes or whatnot, or just nod their head because we've said it so much. But I never want my daughters to come off a basketball court or to come off a track and field and think my parents love me less because of how I performed, or God is disappointed in me because of how I performed. And so we really try to strike that message both before and after, every sporting event. Hey, regardless of how you perform, we love you no matter what. And so that's just a practical thing that we try to do with our children.
That's awesome.
And there's other little tidbits and questions that I try to leave for parents throughout the book. And at the end of every chapter, I try to include some helpful discussion questions, even that you could utilize with your kids. And yeah, there's a lot of practical tools that I think, again, regardless of where you're at on your parenting journey, you'll be able to take away as helpful.
Was there a particular chapter maybe that was both most challenging to write, or maybe at the same time most surprising? Or the most surprises in it as you researched and wrote it.
Uh,
Any that stood out?
Riley, that's a great question. Nothing is coming to mind, right off the bat, but I would say maybe the chapter on Christian moralism was the
Okay,
toughest because it might be the hardest one to pinpoint because, again, externally, it feels and looks good, right? What parent doesn't want to have a good kid?
sure.
What parent want to have a well-behaved kid? But I wrote it because, and this kind of, circles around to a question that you asked earlier about my own sense of why I wrote the book. I grew up in a Christian home, but the emphasis more was on uh, external conformity of just look like you're a good person without true heart change. So, growing up, if you had asked me, hey, why do you think you're going to heaven? I would have just rattled off to you all the list of good things that I had done as a person. That's what my identity was rooted in was God accepts me because I'm a good person. God accepts me because I go to church. God accepts me because I'm not sleeping around doing drugs and drinking alcohol, right?
Hmm.
And when I came to faith in Christ, it was a huge aha moment that my goodness is not what gets me into heaven. It's Christ's sacrifice on the cross that is credited to my account through his atonement. And I think a lot of kids who have grown up like me, that's a big identity struggle, that their
Yeah.
identity gets wrapped up in their good works rather than the good life of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, more and more I look at the prodigal son story and think there are far more older brothers than younger
Yes,
brothers, but we
yes,
definitely make it all about the younger brother,
yes,
but both are outside of the party.
yes. I'm definitely older brother material. I remember the first time I heard that parable preached in a way that I think is how the text intended it. I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I've been reading this wrong so long. I am the older brother. I'm the legalistic, entitled person here who thinks that he can earn God's favor and grace. And it
Yeah.
was a memorable time and a convicting time for me as a believer. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
I think we've already talked about this, with regards to gender and sexuality and things, but maybe just more generally, what advice would you give to parents who feel they've missed the window to shape
Yeah.
their child's identity?
Well, first, I would say again, it's never too late.
Okay.
So, Aaron, if you're listening to this and you have a 17 and a half year old, an 18-year-old, whatever, it is never too late. And what I mean by that is Prayer. Let's start there.
Sure.
Prayer requires nothing of your child, requires everything of you. Of just how can you begin to prayerfully right now ask the Lord for opportunities, windows, catalysts for conversation. Let's say you're a parent whose child is making choices or living a lifestyle that is not congruent with a biblical ethic of sexuality and gender. Well, in the book, I try to give some tools of entering into conversations about those things in compassionate and empathetic ways. So, certain questions like, hey, how did you come to your understanding of this, or this? Or who told you this, or this? Or what do you think it means for you to be the final authority on things related to sexuality and gender? And so I try to give some practical questions, even some postures that parents can embrace, especially with older kids. Open and generous posture, not a closed arm posture.
Hmm.
One of the things that I'll say, especially in those latter chapters on sex and gender, is if at all possible and when at all possible, try to maintain a relationship with kids, even if they have divergent views
Hmm.
of sexuality and gender. So, some parents might arrive at a different conclusion, and I'd want to respect that. If a parent said, "Hey, I've got to, cut ties with my son or cut ties with my daughter," I would
Hmm.
want to respect that. Do those decisions in the context of your local church, council, and community.
Sure.
But in general, my encouragement to parents is maintain relationship as much as you can because influence happens within the context of a relationship. So if you want to continue to have godly influence in your child or even your young adult, grown child's life now, relationship is going to be the best context for that influence to flourish.
Well, that's so good. And interesting to hear you use the word influence. One of my favorite kind of ideas, or most influential for me in parenting, came from Paul Tripp. I forget which book, but where he talks about this transition that happens in a child as he grows into he
Yeah.
or she grows into a teen and above. That you transition uh, from what was the authority kind of to
Um,
influence,
yes.
and your
Yes.
influence is going to depend somewhat upon how you exercised your authority and how
That's
you
such a good
use
point.
those younger years and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, in this world of social media and I don't know the internet, the information age, how does Grounded in Grace address the unique presence of social media and peer influence through that on identity formation?
Right. Good question. I would say you will find a little bit about social media and technology and their influence in the first half of the book, where I talk about modern identity in particular. And modern identity is kind of interesting in that, uh, the culture says, hey, it's all about you and you living your authentic self. But culture is the one relaying that message to our kids. So we have to ask ourselves, who's on first base here? Is it culture or is it the actual individual? And I actually think it's the culture.
Okay.
But it kind of lies to the child and teen and says, hey, you're the one actually making the choice here. And so the way that those messages from culture get communicated to our children and teens, I do think a lot of it happens through social media and technology. Now, you and I probably grew up in the age of, cable TV and the
Hmm.
television. I don't know about your kid. My kids don't really watch TV anymore. They are on streaming devices. They're on YouTube, TikTok,
Hmm.
Snapchat, Instagram, and a lot of social media influencers and even their peers become the dominant voices in their life. And so that again is where I think as parents, you have to take some really thoughtful precautions and develop some really thoughtful plans for how your home and how your family is going to engage with technology and social media. But I also tell parents too, phones are not the enemy. A phone is not going to be the be all or end all of, deciding whether or not your child's going to have a Christ-centered identity, because it's all about the heart of the child that utilizes the phone or the external tools. So sometimes I think we can be a little bit short-sighted in our solutions in that, well, I've got the key to solving this. I'm just going to take my kid's phone away or ban them
Hmm.
from social media. And maybe that might help. It might also embitter your child,
Yeah.
against you. Think deeper. Think about the heart of your child and how your child's heart is interacting and engaging with this content. I think that'll be a more fruitful pathway, an avenue for conversation and discussion.
That might be the answer there, but what would be some common mistakes parents make when guiding their kids in this area? And
Yeah,
then I guess how do they course correct
yes,
in this
yes.
sense?
Well, one of the first things that I see with social media and technology is that parents tend to operate on two extremes. The
Okay.
first extreme is you are going to live as a hermit in a log cabin with zero internet access. We're never giving you access to computer, social media because it's of the devil. And then you've got the other side of free reign. We give the devices over with no standards, no precautions at all. And so, what I try to help parents do, probably not so much in the book, but just through teaching and counseling, is looking at the data, looking at your child's strengths and weaknesses, looking at how your home is situated, and coming to a wise decision about use of technology, of social media, of phones in your home. And I would say one particular writer that I think is really on top of this is Justin Whitmore Early.
Okay.
He's written a book called Habits for the Household, and another book called The Common Rule. And he does a lot of work in this area. He actually filmed a series of videos called Tech Safe. With an organization called Into the Light Ministries, which is based in Canada, and that I've had the chance to participate with as well. He just recently released a 10-part video series on how to engage and interact with the 10 most common tech devices in the home and how to help your children wisely navigate it from PlayStations to Xboxes to iPhones to telephones. And it's so practical and it's really gospel oriented too.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll have to check that out. I haven't heard of that
Yeah,
organization before, but would love to watch a series
yeah,
on that. Maybe kind of the same question we already addressed, but so with when it comes to social media, how important is the parents' own
yeah.
approach to their own
Yes.
devices and screens?
Yes, I think a lot. I think a lot is caught, not taught. And
Okay.
so imagine if your child is watching you be so dialed into your phone or so beholden to your phone at meal times or, as you guys are trying to interact as a family, your kids are going to pick up on that. And just in all honesty, I catch myself with that too. My kids will say, Dad, get off your phone, or Dad, put your phone away. And the way I see it is, man, I've been working all day. Now's my time to pick up my phone and catch up. But I have to remember that this is the only time that my kids are watching me, right? They're not watching me at work because they're at school. And so if all they see me is how I'm interacting and engaging with my phone, then
Mhm.
that's going to send a message, an implicit message to them about the role of social media and technology. And so, again, I don't think that you have to completely never interact or engage with social media or technology. And again, if you come to that choice, that's fine.
Sure.
But I think it's more educating our children on how do we engage those things wisely and biblically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Sometimes, I mean, sometimes definitely the solution is just throw it out, but then it's a
Yeah,
vacuum, something else
it is.
takes its
You-
place.
And that's exactly it, Riley. If you take that out, something else is going to quickly move in to fill that vacuum.
How has, I think you founded Fieldstone
Yeah,
Counseling. Am I
yeah,
right?
yes.
Maybe this is, I don't know, too abstract of a question, but are there ways that Fieldstone Counseling has informed your insights and strategies shared in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. In the most basic way of just case wisdom of, over the course of counseling for nearly 2 decades now, I've had hundreds of thousands of conversations with parents and teens and children and gone, all over the country having conversations. And so much of those conversations have informed just my understanding of the struggles, the hardships, the difficulties that both parents and teens and kids face. I don't think it's an easy world out there for kids and teens. I think it's challenging to live in a way that honors the Lord. I think that the opportunities for persecution, derision, being made fun of or bullied for holding to biblical ethics on gender and sexuality are quite common. And so I don't want to take that lightly. I don't want to take lightly the heartache that I've listened to from parent after parent whose child or teen has chosen to live in a way that's not honoring to the Lord as it relates to their identity. And so So much of what I try to bring to bear in the book and in my time publicly is really informed by the parents and the kids and the teens that I've had the joy of serving in my counseling time.
How are you hoping, Jonathan, this book will equip families to stand firm in a culture that often promotes, again, fluid or
Yes.
self-made identities?
Yes. Well, Riley, coming back to something we mentioned earlier, my hope is just that people pick it up and read it,
Okay.
that it's short and readable, and that people pick it up and realize that they can have these conversations. And not only that they can have these conversations, but that parents themselves would be encouraged and edified that the truth of who God says we are is all we need as human beings. His voice is the best voice. His voice is the most authoritative voice. His voice is the most compassionate voice, and we hear his voice in scripture. So when God says in Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image, and he created the male and female, from the very first words of God, he has given us the building blocks for our identity. And it's up to us if we receive them and live those out, or if we reject them and try to seek our own way.
My last question, Jonathan, and this is probably just my own personal interest,
Yeah.
always to know, who the people I'm reading are reading. Are there any, not even in identity, but just maybe in your own just walk with Christ? What would be some of the most influential books that have shaped you through the years?
Yeah, great question. I would say, in terms of an older book, Augustine's Confessions, which is sort of his
Okay,
autobiography, has been probably one of the most helpful books I've read. I try to come back to it often. Augustine is probably one of the first theologians that we really see have what I would call just an insight into the interior of how human beings function, how they think, what motivates them. And
where
I
did you
find
first come across the Confessions?
I think probably somebody in college might have recommended it to
Okay,
me or something. So, Confessions by Augustine, I think, is a really helpful book. Every Christian, I think, could benefit from it. I would say in more recent days, a recent book that I think many people have read has been Gentle and Lowly by Dane
sure,
Ortland.
yeah.
That book for me, came at a good time. It came during COVID, and I just remember being so encouraged and strengthened in just understanding the heart of Christ for me and for those that He came to save. So, both an old book and a new book, and I love to read. So there's a lot of other books that I'm always happy to recommend. But those are
Mhm.
two that probably stand out at least right now.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time, Jonathan. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for the book that has already been so influential in my life and my family's life. And thanks for the chance to chat with you today.
Thank you, Riley, for having me. I really appreciate it.